Junkie Nation, what's going on? He's back. The great Jon Anik joins us here on the program. What's going on, J.A.?
Fellas, little downtime before UFC 300, but always good to catch up with you fellas. I know you're amidst your March Madness chaos right now, so it's good to see you boys.
Goes is in third place out of 65, so he's pretty happy right now.
It's a nice way to arrive at the Sweet 16, brother. You're pretty sharp, though, I would think, historically, when you're filling out a bracket.
I've won a couple, yeah. As of late, I've been a little hot.
So there you go.
He took down an eliminator, right, Goes? Or was that it?
Mm-hmm.
What was that game where you were down like 28-7? You thought your goose was cooked. Was it the Vikings in like
the Vikings
2022 season?
I was already writing my concession speech and everything when they came back.
They came back like 4 TDs, like one of those Houston and Buffalo games. Like,
right,
35-3, and then they won 38-35. Something crazy like that. John, I wanted to ask you, and I may have asked you this before, but we've had you on a lot, and I don't want to just throw gotcha questions at you, or that's bullshit. So I want to ask you this: when you're doing those intros, and you kind of have a little bit of your intro in front of you, you get feedback from people on Instagram, and you're getting everyone pumped up. Before or after one of those, have you ever locked eyes with a celeb, an athlete, and whether you're starstruck or not, it just threw you off, or you just thought, oh man, that's pretty cool? The example I'll give, and this may trigger whether I've asked this or not, is when Montana was in the huddle against the Bengals in 1988. 2 minutes left, they got their timeouts, but still, right? It's a clutch drive, it's the final drive, and Harris Barton, offensive tackle, is sitting there, and he's really, really nervous. So Montana, to calm him down, goes, "Hey Harris, AH," I think he told me, goes, "Ain't that John Candy over there?" And Harris Barton tells the story like, "We're freaking out. This is the Super Bowl, and this guy's so cool. He's actually like just noticing things that no one else is because he's calm." So anyways, back to this. Have you ever had those moments, I guess, now that you've been doing this for so long, where it's just something that's just cool about your job?
So it's a great question. I've had one moment like that, and I will never forget it because he's one of my all-time favorite athletes. So I wasn't doing the standard pay-per-view open, but you may have noticed over the last 2 years or so, I'll have certain situations during the broadcast where I do like a stand-up on camera where I'm sort of close to the crowd and I'll memorize something and then I'll deliver it and throw to a feature. So I'm getting ready in my stand-up position to do one of these, to execute one of these. And I look down and there's a big hand reaching out to like give me a fist bump. And I look down and it's Shaquille O'Neal. And if that doesn't fire you up to fist bump that dude and then deliver to camera, right? I'm not sure how I delivered. It was probably one of the greatest deliveries of my life, right? It gave me a lot of confidence, probably the opposite of nerves, or I guess the good kind of nerves. But if I screw up the delivery of a pay-per-view open, and rest assured, anyone who follows me on Instagram knows I probably over-rehearse these things, and maybe that would be a reason why I would screw it up. But no matter how many times I rehearse and memorize that pay-per-view open, if we do 14 pay-per-views in 2024, I'll probably screw up a couple of them. Now, the viewer may not know at home, but we lose the no-hitter pretty early. I lost it this year already. I had one that I thought was perfectly written and wasn't able to execute it perfectly on fight night. But it is what it is. We move on. But only one real instance where a celebrity was, in sort of my frame of mind as I was just about to deliver something, and that would be the great Shaquille O'Neal.
You think we'll ever get someone like him? Either we've had 6'11" with Struve, if I'm not mistaken. So just, I guess, the 7 foot mark. 300 pounds, but cuts to 265, maybe a former hoopster. You think we'll get a giant like that?
This guy, Despain, is enormous. I think he's listed at 6'7", so it's hard for me to believe that you're actually going to have a 7-footer who weighs 266 pounds and looks good doing it. When we see this Despain cat from Cuba walk into our fighter meeting, I mean, he isn't as big a man, maybe all told, as like a Tommy Aspinall, but my goodness, does he completely fill up a doorway. So it's hard for me to envision 4 or 5 more inches, I never thought they could get much bigger than Greg Hardy in that octagon, but Despain is an absolute monster, and we're pretty excited to see what he can do. He's off to a pretty good start.
Yeah, for sure. I think someone like a Hakeem Olajuwon would have been pretty amazing,
Oh.
just because how athletic he was. He used to be a goalie in Africa. I don't want to say the wrong country. I think it was Nigeria, but he used to be a goalie in soccer before he even became a basketball player. And he was one of the greatest centers, defensive centers for sure, but centers in the history of National Basketball Association. John, I saw something about 24 hours ago. 10% of all of the UFC's champions in the history are on this card. How sick is that?
It's unbelievable. And I think sometimes when I suggest to the masses that, say, UFC 299 is the best fight card I've ever been assigned, it lands as being promotional hyperbole or hyperbolic, or me just trying to pump up a live event because the UFC wants me to do so, when in actuality, it is not that at all. I'm looking down at UFC 299 fight card in Miami, and I'm thinking, man, I've been doing this since 2011. I've never been assigned a better fight card, and UFC 300 is better. Hate to break the news to everybody, but it's absolutely incredible. And I guess for me, the visual of Davis and Figueiredo walking out at like 3:30 in the afternoon at T-Mobile Arena is just absurd. The amount of high-level talent that is competing on preliminary portions of this fight card and not even featured prelims is like nothing I've ever seen. So I know it's been sort of popular to compare those two fight cards. UFC 300 is just absurd. And the thought of champions, future Hall of Famers walking out at 3:30 in the afternoon, I wonder how it's going to affect the crowd. Right? Historically, it's a little bit of a later arriving crowd in Las Vegas, not necessarily like boxing, but I wonder how many people are going to be there when Davis and Figueiredo and Cody Garbrandt engage in the middle of the afternoon.
It's true, man. And Jim fucking Miller follows them right after. We'll get to him in just a sec. But I'm not complaining. All the great fights you want to give me, I'll do it, right? But why do you think the UFC felt the urge to make it so deep? Like, there's some Brazilian fighters that are pretty legit that I would love to see them compete in their home country the following month. And I don't think it would take away from anyone's feeling of, getting their money's worth. I mean, no one's going to complain about that because this card's so profound. Have you heard anything or just in talking to all the people why they felt like they just needed to make this so stacked?
No, I mean, I would suggest to you that UFC 400 is probably 8 years away. So that's probably the shortest answer I could give you as to why UFC 300 is so loaded. I'm probably not going to be the guy calling UFC 400 8 years from now. You know what I mean? These milestone events happen pretty infrequently. Certainly UFC 350, it stands to reason, could be special. UFC 250 happened during a COVID climate. But there's a lot of different athletes on the roster that have a lot of different intentions. There's some fighters that maybe don't want to compete in their native country, right? I think if you ask Renato Moicano, he would love to compete at UFC 301 in Rio, and maybe he can make that quick turn. But the opportunity to compete at UFC 300 and then maybe to compete on a future numbered card in Brazil would probably be the ideal situation. So I think a lot of athletes just had an appetitive nature to be on this fight card. And, even if it didn't necessarily have the wowing championship triple header that some fans expected, it is as good a fucking fight card as I've ever been assigned, to be sure.
John, you mentioned that crowd, and I had kind of wondered the same thing because, you look at like an event like a WrestleMania, they're there from the beginning, right? They make the big theatrics and all that. But you're right, in combat sports, sometimes people do file in a little bit later. What I wanted to ask you was, you called it the fight capital of the world. You lived here. It's the fight capital of the world to all of us. But all of these fights that are taking place in Saudi Arabia, this seems like it's becoming not a bigger venue, but it just seems like they're putting a lot more than some of these boxing matches. Like over here, it's a little bit more traditional. Over there, it's becoming this big show. Do you feel like eventually Las Vegas might lose a little bit to some of these cards? Maybe some of these bigger cards might go to a Saudi Arabia?
Certainly, I think it stands to reason that big pay-per-views could end up in Saudi Arabia, but I don't know that any fight town ever will be able to lay claim to being the fight capital of the world the way Las Vegas has that distinction. Now, there was a time during the global pandemic where you might have heard us promotionally refer to Abu Dhabi as the fight capital of the world, and at that time, it certainly was. But how many times have you heard me on a fighter walkout suggest that every mixed martial arts athlete hopes to make this walk in the UFC, but to make this walk in Las Vegas? I believe Michael Venom Page has never competed in Las Vegas, and I would be stunned if his next fight is not in Las Vegas. We might have a big pay-per-view this summer in England, right? Every fighter wants to fight in Las Vegas, right? Every broadcast journalist and print journalists in combat sports like me growing up wanted to cover the big fights in Las Vegas. So Las Vegas will always be the fight capital of the world to me, and it would feel very unnatural for me on broadcast referring to anywhere else in the world other than Vegas as the fight capital. So excited to be in Saudi Arabia in June, excited to see that imprint continue. But as a former Nevada resident who still has his Nevada driver's license in the drawer right here, Las Vegas, heretofore and always is the fight capital of the world. Does that answer your question?
That's what's up.
Yeah, and please come back. We've all been saying that for a long time. Eventually, we want you to come back to Vegas. We think we'd have a lot of fun with you. Look, UFC 300, we get it. UFC, their job is to make this feel a little extra special, a little different than other cards. Fighters are probably going to pull a gear that we didn't even know existed out of them because they're on this card. The broadcast team, is there anything in particular that you guys are going to do when you huddle up? Any different type of motivational speech, any conversation that you guys need to have? What is it that you feel will be a little different on your guys' end for this card?
Always good questions from you, brother, but the way I've tried to approach this job doesn't allow me to lean too far into that line of thinking. Certainly there might be added bells and whistles, and maybe when it comes to my actual pay-per-view open, it won't be so centered upon Alex Pineda and Jamal Hill. It might be more wide-ranging thematically in terms of what I talk about. But I approach every little UFC fight night at the Apex the way I approach these pay-per-views in terms of the preparation, the performance, and just showing up with as much energy as humanly possible. So I don't treat UFC 300 any differently in my mind, with the exception of that pay-per-view open. I remember when we were doing Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier on Fight Island, and there were like drones flying around and having to pick up different cameras and things like that. That might have actually been in Las Vegas, but regardless, I'm always ready and excited to see what our amazing producers will do as far as, added variables. But for me, my brother, it's my system, my process, my formatics is probably not going to change too much, but you never know.
You get to call a Kayla Harrison fight here. We know how meticulous you are in your research and all that. What have you seen, and what do you believe Kayla Harrison will ultimately bring to the UFC crowd?
Well, the fight before the fight's going to be wicked interesting, is it not? I mean, of all the storylines that we'll be following on weigh-in day, I think her stepping on that scale at 136 pounds is chief among them. But I'm just so inspired by her story as a parent, and, her adopting her niece and nephew and mothering those children the way that she has, right? Adding to the base that is Kayla Harrison professionally, athletically, and otherwise. She's just a superhuman being. And it's always an honor when you have one of these high-level combat sports athletes, Hall of Famer in their own right, high-level specialists coming into the UFC. And we've seen a lot of fighters like Bo Nickal and Alex Pineda. They come into the UFC as these specialist types, and they have this huge fan base and following embedded already. And there's so much intrigue with the fan base to see how these athletes do. And I think with respect to what Kayla Harrison has accomplished as an MMA athlete, we're very excited to see what she can do with Holly Holm, and she can do in this setting because, to harken back to Michael Venom Page last month or earlier this month, this show, in terms of the staff and everything else, it's a different beast. But we're excited to have Kayla on the roster, to be sure.
I'm not sure why it bothers me so much that Bo Nickal is on the main card. I have nothing against the dude, and I agree that he'll be pretty great one day. He's like on this incredible trajectory. Calm me down, John. Tell me why. Like, I know other fighters are like, hey, I get paid the same. I think they're just trying to be good company men and women. But explain to us maybe from the production side of why it's so important for them to feature this young fella in a fight where, look, he's a huge favorite, so even from the competition side, we're not seeing like, oh, two guys that are, 5-0, 6-0 colliding or nothing like that.
So when Khamzat Chimaev came on to the scene, it was during the global pandemic. And I would almost spin this question back around to you guys and the fan base. When it comes to these certain athletes, Khamzat Chimaev. I would even throw out there 18-year-old Raul Rosas fucking Jr., right? Bo Nickal. There's just a different electricity when it comes to some of these guys. You parlay their fight style with the expectation and the pressure and the fan intrigue. And I just think Bo Nickal checks a lot of boxes. Like for us, when we get through our pay-per-view open and we have that exhale moment when we get to sit down and watch that first fight on pay-per-view with all of the masses around the world, that's a very strategic position on the card. It's a prime slot. Maybe at times you don't get as many people as seen during the featured prelim on ESPN, but they don't mess around when it comes to that first fight. And I can't necessarily speak to Cody Brundage and the decision to feature him against Bo Nickal, but do you guys sort of hear some of that comp when it comes to Khamzat Chimaev, right? Khamzat, for Dana, for me, for a lot of us who are really embedded and really close to this stuff, there's nothing quite like the electricity of a Khamzat Chimaev fight. And I think Bo Nickal checks a lot of those boxes. I'm not at all surprised to see him on pay-per-view, whether the card's the deepest in UFC history or not. What do you think?
Well, as soon as you said his name to lay the comparison, I thought, no, okay. Like I said, explain it to me from your side. I'm never against no, I'm right and you're wrong and you ain't gonna change my mind. But the only thing I'll say is when Goes brought up Kayla Harrison, it was a question I was gonna ask you about as well. Think about other sports where all three of us are fans of other sports. You have a free agent signing, and a lot of teams will actually just create a day, especially in soccer, where they'll trot out that new athlete and everyone goes berserk. And I realize this is just a different sport because they're not part of a team, but they are part of the UFC. I just thought the UFC would flex a little bit more and have a Harrison. I remember Eddie Alvarez and Cerrone had a great fight. That was Alvarez's first fight. I remember Askren and Robbie Lawler, controversial or not, and then he grabs the mic. He goes, "Hey, Dana, ain't you got anyone better?" Chandler, I think, knocked out Hooker or something like that. Like, there's just plenty of times where they have been able to flex the free agent muscle. I'm sure they paid her good money, so I just thought it was going to be her spot. And she shines on the mic. You know what I mean? Right, she's really exceptional. She's got the whole USA Olympic background. Holly Holm, super popular. I don't know. I just thought, wow, that's a tough one to beat out. What's the reasoning? And that's why I'm asking.
No, and those are fair points. And it does stand to reason with the television clock in play during the prelims that Kayla Harrison, if she beats Holly Holm by decision, she might not get a microphone. Now, in a perfect world, all of these athletes would get a microphone. But I think the public perception flies in the face of the truth a little bit when it comes to that, right? Like oftentimes the fighter who wins the featured prelim leading into the pay-per-view, if you win on points, you might not get a microphone despite the magnitude of that fight. I think you preach a lot of truths when it comes to Kayla Harrison, but I do have some ignorance when it comes to these decisions and how they're made. To what extent does Kayla Harrison help drive the pay-per-view competing on ESPN? How many people see Kayla Harrison perform on ESPN versus how many buy the pay-per-view at UFC 300? How much does it really matter that Calvin Kattar and Aljamain Sterling are not competing on pay-per-view? I don't know. What are their expectations for Kayla Harrison versus Holly Holm in terms of that fight's individual ability to entertain? We certainly thought Amanda Hebos and Rose Namajunas was going to be an entertaining main event. And it was at times, certainly in those middle rounds, I had a good time, but maybe relative to expectation, that main event came up a little short. I think there's a lot of things that go into it. And, I'll watch Kayla fight at any time, but you're not wrong that some should be surprised and could be surprised that she's not on pay-per-view.
Have you had any requests like the one that they're floating by Bruce Buffer to say Jim fucking Miller? Have you ever had any unusual requests? What do you think of that request? I heard you say, hey, there's always the weigh-ins, right? So that's kind of pretty cool. I mean, this guy, it's pretty incredible what he's done, the longevity he's had, and he's obviously had some health issues, but I couldn't be happier for that dude, man, to be performing at UFC 300.
Crazy. His Lyme disease story and everything that Jim Miller has gone through to continue to win and just turn back young challengers and veterans that came up alongside him. I rember when we were sitting on ESPN MMA Live, me and Kenny Florian, and we announced in 2008 that he and his brother Dan had signed with the UFC. It's fucking 2024. So all hail Jim Miller. I can't promise that I'm not going to drop a Jim fucking Miller on the broadcast, but I'm going to try to stay in my lane. The only time I can remember having a real request was actually, and it's somewhat timely, depending on when you ingest this content, Nate the Train. If I put somebody away, and I don't think I called his first 7 UFC fights. I think not until he fought Dan Ige did I actually call a Nate Landwehr fight. But he said, it's Nate the Train, man. You know, if I knock a motherfucker out, it's Nate the Train. It's not Nate Landwehr. It's not, you know, Landwehr flattens the opposition. Try to hammer home that Nate the Train. So we tried to hit that pretty hard, even though that fight didn't go his way. So you can be sure the next time Nate the Train knocks a guy out and I'm on the call, you're not going to hear me shouting Landwehr. But yeah, we don't get a lot of requests. I mean, certainly we try to keep it as accurate as possible. Sometimes we'll get late requests when it comes to corner men or women or gyms and things like that. But nothing like the buffer request for UFC 300, that's for sure.
Yeah, and one more thing here, and then Goes will finish up. His opponent, Bobby Green, this guy was on an affliction card against a Lozon brother, Dan, if I'm not mistaken. Like this is like 15, 16 years. So not just Miller getting down, but Bobby Green on a high stage as well. If you'll recall, Goes, didn't he kick Lozon in the nuts 3 times? And each time he was like, what? That ain't me. That ain't me. And then finally on the third one, he looks and he goes, oh, that's my bad. My bad. It was so funny, dude. It brought back some memories, but I really love that pairing.
And I love you giving the King some shine, right? Because it did stand to reason that Bobby King Green at some point could have retired without realizing some of the financial freedom that he now has. I remember in one of our fighter meetings, he was saying, I'm trying to buy 3 different houses for my 3 kids. And he eventually was able to accomplish that mission. You know, I think always appreciated by the avids and the hardcore fans, an acquired taste maybe when it comes to some of the more casual fans, but just a great style, a great stylist, a great ambassador for me, for MMA and for fatherhood and everything else. I am a huge Bobby King Green fan. And, you know, I think it's fitting that he's competing on UFC 300, but I'll always just come back to the late career money for him, just seeing him headline and take short notice opportunities and compete as well as he has at his age. You know, I'm happy to see him get a featured spot here at 300.
John, I'm going to steal one of your lines. It's 2024. We have the stadium. If I open my window right now, I see Allegiant Stadium. When can we get in there? And who are the fighters that can possibly carry a card at Allegiant Stadium for the UFC?
Well, the cupboard is never bare, so I think the good news is that you have a lot of ascending superstars, guys like Alex Pereira and Ilia Topuria that certainly could sell out that building. But I'm not beating any horse that hasn't been beaten to death when I suggest that Dana White has outlined some of the challenges when it comes to executing stadium shows, and maybe he doesn't love some of the things that are inconvenient truths that come with stadium shows. I mean, I remember being there in Toronto with ESPN, and, you know, at one point I went up to the bleeds just to sit in those 300s or 500s, and, you know, there are some things that aren't necessarily ideal about it, you know, but I think as far as having the athletes to do it and having the fan base that can do it, right? One thing I didn't say when I was going off on Las Vegas is the fight capital of the world. Have our pay-per-views ever been the commodities that they are in Las Vegas right now? I mean, those tickets are hotter than ever for our UFC pay-per-views in Las Vegas. So I feel pretty convicted in saying that we can bang that place out and have the athletes to do it. I just think from a broadcasting standpoint, from an in-house perspective, there are just some hurdles that we'll have to clear.
John, if we look at the roster for UFC 300, we got a little bit of everything there. But if you had to guess, if you had to be a gambling man, will the gloves come off for any athlete that night, do you anticipate?
Will any athlete retire at UFC 300? So without the fight card in front of me, I will say no. I don't know that anybody is really on the cusp of retirement. Yeah, I just think Jim Miller, the paydays right now and the game right now are all pretty darn good. So I don't think that we'll see Jim Miller retire. I don't think Holly Holm's going to retire, win or lose. Anybody else that could be potentially?
That would have been the other one.
Yeah. I don't see Jim Miller doing it. I really don't. You know, I think that certainly distancing these records from any future chasers is probably something that is a goal for him. He's not going to compete at UFC 400 in 2032. But I don't think win or lose, you see Jim Miller retire at UFC 300. And he really has done it all in terms of box checking, right? He had all the kids show up at a fight and he dusted the guy in like 2 minutes, you know. So I don't know that there's much else to do for Jim Miller other than maybe try to get back to the top 15, maybe get one more main event. But I'd be stunned, honestly, just given his current form, to see him walk away.
You snuck one by the Goldie a little while ago. Just staying on this theme. Sorry, Goes, to cut you off.
Mm-hmm.
You said you might not make it to UFC 400. That's 8 years away. I have told you this before. I would love to see you have some sort of a Vince Scully-ish type run. Johnny Most, I'll throw one at you. So it was one of those types of runs with the UFC. And I know recently you had some comments and then you clarified them. But bro, you're kind of our guy. You know what I'm saying? And you say it's the best seat in the house. You love your job. I certainly hope it's nothing on your end, that's for sure. And if it's on their end, then they need to know that they have one of the GOATs here of play-by-play, working for them. So I certainly hope you make it to UFC 400. Can you maybe expand on what you meant, or was that just something that floated out with no real backing to it?
Well, health is wealth. I appreciate all your words as always, and you guys have been tremendous supporters over the years, but gosh, as trite as it sounds, nothing is guaranteed. So I have to have that mentality and I have to have that approach. And as I've said repeatedly, I'm trying to create a gap, right, between me and all the guys trying to come get my job. So that's really my focus. But gosh, I mean, to think about being in year 23 of doing this, 8 years from now, I mean, I don't know. I think that's a tremendous run. I still think there are a lot of sports broadcasters, like even Brad Nessler this weekend in his late 60s, still crushing it on the NCAA tournament. But no, I just don't know if I want to be that 55, 6-year-old guy sticking around getting in the way of the young guys. But at least right now, and for the indefinite future, my focus is on my craft. It is on mixed martial arts play-by-play and trying to get better in terms of my preparation and my process and my performance for every show. And hopefully I call UFC 400, but we're just trying to make it to UFC 300 right now, my guy.
It's not your fault. You were just born at a time, at a different time than they were or whatever. But Cosell, Lampley, a lot of these guys, Bernstein, well past 50, 60, can still get down. And they do it well. So don't let the fact that you're not creating a spot for someone else, let that stop you from doing what you do. You do such an excellent job.
Well, thank you, buddy. I feel like my inner circle is honest enough and tight enough that if I started to lose a step a little bit, and I'd probably notice it watching it back, but verbally, as soon as I start to lose some of the orating skills, like I'm not going to be a corpse up there just cashing a check and trying to be up there for legacy or nostalgia. I'll be long gone.
Yeah. John, you said Jim Miller won't be part of UFC 400, but I do want to remind you something. The three of us, when we're together, we will things into existence. Remember what happened with Laura Sanko, how quick that all turned around? Here's what I would like you to consider. And we've already brought this up to Jim Miller. Okay. I feel like he should just be a part of those cards going forward at whatever capacity. But what if he was in the broadcast booth with you guys? I just think he should be a part of them going forward. Would you entertain that?
I absolutely love that. And I don't want to take credit for Brandon Moreno being in the booth with us for a couple of fights at Noche UFC, but it was my podcast producer, Cody Merrow, who suggested that to me. I brought it to the UFC, Zach Candido, and I think that was sort of the foundation for that happening. Yes, I think it's a great idea to have Jim Miller be a part of UFC 400 and, God willing, UFC 500. And far be it from me to put it past the guy to compete deep into his 40s at UFC 400. I just think knowing Jim the way I do, he's not going to be sticking around. There's too much recreational pursuit in that man's life in terms of hunting and farming and everything else.
Last one from me, the gorilla in the background. Does he have a name yet? And if not, can we name him?
I mean, I like Gus, but certainly we could open it up to the MMA junkie masses. But Gus, the Golden Gorilla, is the leader in the clubhouse.
I do like Gus. I was going to pitch Bernie. How about you, George?
Yeah, I like Bernie too.
I was going to pitch Goes, but Gus is close enough.
Goes is not bad.
It's not bad.
Someone suggested, Till for Darren Till, but I think Gus, the Golden Gorilla, is pretty good,
Gus is pretty good, yeah.
So
let's close with some ball busting. At any point when you're at the T-Mobile and you look up and see that Golden Knights banner, are you going to go, oh, what could have been?
No, I mean, I will say the Stanley Cup is the hardest pro sports championship to win. And I will never forget my Boston Bruins doing it in 2011 when I was, 33 years of age. I went to Game 6 in Boston at the time. I could barely afford the $500 for the nosebleed seat. But no, I'm happy for the Golden Knights. I can't say that I root for them or that I root for any of the Vegas teams per se, but I'm happy for the fan base. I mean, most of my friends are VGK fans. So,
all right. Thank you as always for the time. Cannot wait for UFC 300. It's going to be an epic event. I hope to be back in the United States just to get out there and throw some elbows, rub some elbows with you guys. I know it'll be a busy week, but even a hello means a lot. So anyway, thank you for stopping by. Junkie Nation loves you. So goes and I.
Love you guys anytime. My line is always open, and we'll see you boys in a couple weeks in Vegas.
Anaconda in the house.
Let's go. Thank you, guys.